It was a night like any other. The wind was gently blowing outside, tapping against the windows, but inside, everything was still. Too still, maybe. Laura had just returned from a long day at work, and as she stepped into her house, she was immediately hit by the sense of loneliness. She was alone, and the house felt quieter than usual. She turned on the lights in the living room, and as she shrugged off her coat, tossing it onto the couch, her eyes fixed on the TV, still off. A quiet night of rest was all she needed. She would sit on the couch, play some soft music to fill the silence, and hopefully forget the stress of the day. But for some reason, the silence in the house was unsettling. The kind of silence that goes beyond mere peace, almost like the house was waiting for something, watching. She shook her head, trying to push away the strange thoughts, and turned on the TV, looking for some comfort in the random programming. As the screen powered up, Laura headed to the kitchen to make a quick snack. But as she turned to return to the living room, the sound of the TV was off. The screen was black, still, no sign of life. She frowned, staring at the TV, wondering if she had accidentally pressed a button. But no, it was completely off. The remote was on the coffee table, within reach, and the power switch on the TV was far enough that it couldn't have been accidentally switched off. It must be the tiredness, she thought, trying to brush off the discomfort. She returned to the couch and settled back in. The house was silent, but the kind of unsettling silence she could never quite describe. Like something was about to happen, but hadn't shown itself yet. She glanced around one last time, trying to convince herself she was just being paranoid. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. And then, the silence was broken by a low, unmistakable sound. Something coming from the kitchen. Laura froze on the couch. The sound had been so subtle, almost imperceptible, that she doubted her own ears. A low, scratching noise, like something was being moved across the surface of the kitchen table. But when she looked toward the source of the sound, there was nothing out of place. The silence took over the house again, even heavier than before. She stood up slowly, forcing her steps to make no sound, but with each movement, the noise seemed to grow louder in her head. She looked toward the kitchen and, with a sigh, walked over there, hoping to find a glass or some item that had fallen or shifted. The kitchen light was on, illuminating the simple furniture, the dining table, and the neatly organized utensils. But nothing seemed out of place. The sound didn't repeat, and the house returned to silence. She gave the table one last glance, finding nothing that could have caused the noise, and it was when she turned to head back to the living room that she heard it. This time, it was clear. The sound of the TV turning on, but Laura knew she had left the device off. The remote was still on the coffee table. What unsettled her even more was the fact that she could hear the TV, but there was no picture on the screen. The screen was black, just like before, but the sound of a faint broadcast was unmistakable, a distant murmur filling the space with a growing sense of discomfort. She took a hesitant step into the living room, as if fearing something invisible was waiting for her. Her eyes locked on the TV, now with the sound clearly audible, but no picture at all. She moved closer slowly, the sound growing sharper, and her hands trembled as she reached out to press the power button. And it was in that exact moment that the sound changed. The TV emitted a low but clear word, as if someone were whispering directly to her. A name. Her name. Laura. She jerked back abruptly, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but undeniably hers. She had no doubt about that. What was that? She muttered to herself, trying to convince herself she was just too tired to process what was happening. But the terror began to seep into her mind. Something wasn't right. She looked around. The room felt increasingly suffocating, as if the house was closing in around her. But before she could process what she was feeling, the sound came again. "Laura, you can't escape." The voice seemed to come from the TV, but also from somewhere else. Something else. Something much closer. Laura stood frozen in front of the TV, her eyes locked on the black screen that seemed to swallow up any trace of light. Her own voice seemed to be pulled into the screen, but she knew that couldn't be possible. Fear spread through her body, and a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't move, couldn't react. The words kept echoing, as if the house itself was becoming the echo of her own mind. "Laura, you will never be alone." She took a step back, the sound of the voice ringing in her head. No matter how much she tried to rationalize, the feeling that someone else was in the house with her intensified. The voice was hers, but it wasn't. It was distorted, subtly altered, as if something was pretending to be her. She looked again at the remote, as if hoping that by pressing it, everything would disappear, but when she pressed the button, the sound didn't stop. On the contrary, the voices multiplied, coming from different corners of the house. Now, she heard whispers in every corner, unintelligible words intertwining with her own voice. She ran down the hallway, trying to make sense of what was happening. As she passed the dining room door, she heard it again. "Laura, we finally found you." The tone of her own voice was imbued with something strange, something she didn't recognize. It was as if the word "found" was being spoken by something that shouldn't be there. The house seemed to pulse, as if the walls were closing in around her, increasing the pressure, making everything more claustrophobic. She gripped the doorknob of the bedroom door, her eyes wide, trying to escape the voices, but the words kept coming, growing clearer. The voice calling her name sounded farther away, yet closer at the same time, as if it were coming from inside her own head. A chill ran through her body, the idea that something unknown was trying to communicate with her. With each step, more voices emerged, some whispering, others almost shouting. They spoke of her childhood, mentioning things she had never told anyone. "Remember, I've always been here. Will you let me in?" Each word felt like a mark on her soul, as if something was trying to figure out who she really was. Panic took over. She ran to the center of the living room, stopping, her gaze fixed on the shadows dancing around her, trying to understand where the voices were coming from. As if her mind could no longer distinguish between what was real and what wasn't, she turned abruptly and ran toward the upper floor, thinking that by distancing herself from the sound, she might find some relief. But when she reached the stairs, the voice whispered again, "Laura, you can't escape." She spun around and ran to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. But as soon as she turned, she heard the sound of something heavy being dragged across the house. She didn't know what it was, but the sound was getting closer, closer than ever. Now, she felt she was no longer alone. Something was watching her. Time seemed to stop as Laura stayed locked in the bathroom, her eyes fixed on the mirror. Her reflection remained unchanged, but the environment around her seemed to distort with every passing second. She no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. The voices continued, a mix of whispers and incomprehensible words, but deep down, she began to recognize a pattern. The words weren't just an echo, they were trying to guide her, shaping the reality around her. Suddenly, the mirror in front of her shimmered with a faint glow, as if touched by a subtle light. Laura's reflection began to change slowly. She watched with growing horror as her image in the mirror smiled, but she didn't. That image, that version of herself, seemed to have a life of its own. The smile in the reflection was mischievous, something she had never done. The face she knew, with its familiar features, now appeared as a distorted mask of something alien. "Don't you see it yet?" The voice in the mirror whispered, her own voice, but filled with a strange, dark quality. "You're lost, Laura." She took a step back, feeling her legs weaken under the weight of fear. The mirror no longer reflected her reality. The image of herself stared back at her with a penetrating gaze, almost mocking her. That reflection seemed detached, becoming something separate, as if preparing to take her place. "We can't wait any longer," the reflection said. "You're the key." Panic took hold of Laura, and on impulse, she turned the bathroom door handle, trying to escape that place that now felt more suffocating than ever. But as she opened the door, she came face to face with something that made her stop immediately. The house was different. The living room, the hallway. Everything seemed darker, as if the light had been drained, leaving only a thick shadow. The walls were closer, as if the house had shrunk while she was locked away. Every sound was amplified, and the voices seemed to crawl through the walls, infiltrating her mind. But the most terrifying thing of all was the hallway ahead of her. It was empty, except for one thing. A recording was playing, coming from within the house. It was her own voice. "Laura, you're getting closer." It was a message recorded somewhere in the house. But from where? How could it be her speaking if she was standing there in that moment, having never made that recording? Desperation flooded her body, and she ran, mindlessly, to the back of the house, where the sound seemed to be the loudest. When she reached the bedroom, she found the source of the sound. On her nightstand, a small recorder was playing. The tape inside it turned slowly, repeating the words, "You're getting closer." But the most disturbing thing was the expression on Laura's face, reflected in the small screen of the recorder. She knew she had never said that. The pieces were falling into place. The game was now complete. Something was masquerading as her, something she couldn't control. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if her own thoughts were being manipulated by some external force. With her heart racing, Laura slowly backed away from the table. The weight of reality crashed down on her, and the only thing she knew for certain was that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. She was trapped in her own home. But the worst part, something was inside with her. Laura barely had time to breathe before she heard the voice again, echoing in her mind. It was like a sigh, a whisper that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. She spun her head quickly, her eyes scanning the darkness of the house. But no one was there, only silence, broken by the sound of the recording still playing, repeating the same words like a mantra. "You're getting closer." The feeling that someone was watching her, controlling her, became even more unbearable. It was as if an invisible presence had infiltrated her mind, distorting her thoughts and emotions. She could no longer distinguish what was real from what wasn't. Every movement seemed observed, every breath amplified in the emptiness of her own isolation. She began to walk through the house, the sound of her own footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. What terrified her most wasn't the voices or the whispers that surrounded her, but the fact that she felt she was no longer alone. Something was there, not just physically, but in her mind, an invisible entity that knew her better than she knew herself. Entering the kitchen, the environment was completely different. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist, taking on distorted shapes that moved as she drew closer. It was as if the house was gaining a life of its own, reacting to her presence, molding itself to her mental state. She approached the counter, trying to find something to help her escape the constant feeling of being hunted. That's when something caught her attention. A photo on the table. She picked it up with trembling hands, and as she looked at the image, her heart almost stopped. It was a photo of her as a child, taken in a park. She knew she had seen that photo before, but there was something strange about it. The child in the photo smiled in a way she shouldn't, with a forced smile, as if hiding something. What disturbed her the most, however, was a detail she had never noticed before. In the background, a shadowy figure, a hooded being, stood watching her. Laura felt the blood freeze in her veins. How had that photo ended up there? How could something so disturbing be present in such an innocent moment from her childhood? She was about to drop the photo when she heard a soft but clear voice coming from the living room. Her own voice again. But this time, the words were different, more threatening. "You still don't understand, Laura. I am you, and you are me." The fear hit her like a wave, and she dropped the photo to the floor. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to get out of that house, but the voices wouldn't let her. They were everywhere, invading her mind, crushing her will. She was being swallowed by something that seemed like a twisted version of herself, a presence that was now taking over the house and, ultimately, her very identity. Not knowing what to do, she made her way back to the bathroom mirror, as if the answer might be there. Maybe the house was trying to tell her something more. She had to understand before it was too late. When she looked into the mirror, she didn't see her own reflection. Instead, she saw a version of herself with completely black eyes, as if the being in front of her had fully taken over her essence. The reflection smiled again, but this time, the smile wasn't just mocking. It was the smile of someone who was in control. "You'll never be the same. Now, you are mine." Laura took a step back, terror overtaking her body, but then something strange happened. The reflection didn't move. It just stood there, staring back at her, as if waiting. That's when the truth revealed itself. A truth she didn't want to accept, but one that had become so deeply rooted in her mind that she couldn't ignore it any longer. The house wasn't just filled with voices. She was being consumed, transformed, and the entity inside her was taking control, piece by piece, stealing her identity. She now knew what she would have to do to escape, but the price would be steep. The game was about to begin, and this time, she would be the centerpiece. Laura didn't know how she had come to this conclusion, but the truth was now crystal clear in her mind. The house, with its twisting hallways and distorted echoes, wasn't just a physical place. It was a prison, and she wasn't alone there anymore. Something had been watching her the entire time, something that was merging with her, changing her, pulling her deeper into the abyss. She felt an increasing pressure on her mind, as if her own memories were unraveling, replaced by others, distorted, as though a different version of herself was trying to take her place. Her perception was fragmenting, and every breath, every step, felt like it was being watched by an invisible presence. The reflection in the mirror had given her a clear warning, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed to escape, but the cost would be terrible. Something inside the house was waiting for her, and she knew that it would be too late once she made the wrong move. She stepped away from the mirror, her gaze fixed on the door. But before she could leave, she heard her voice once again. Not from the recorder, not from the walls or the mirror, but directly in her mind. She wasn't sure if the voice was speaking to her or if it was just trying to invade her perception, but she felt she couldn't ignore it. "You can't leave, Laura. You already belong to me." The words reverberated like a wave of heat, burning through her mind. She looked around, her hands sweating, but found herself paralyzed, as if an invisible force had tied her to that spot. The air felt thick, as if the house was sucking the energy from everything around her, leaving her drained, weak. Her thoughts were becoming harder to organize, like she was losing control over her own body. Suddenly, a shadow formed on the wall in front of her. It wasn't a regular shadow. It was human-shaped, but not a person. It was more like a silhouette, a presence that shifted fluidly, as if it were distorting as she watched. Laura instinctively knew that the shadow wasn't just any entity. It was a thing that had been consuming her, feeding on her essence, on her identity. She didn't know how, but she felt that the shadow wanted to replace her, take her place, invade her body and soul. She tried to move, but her muscles were stiff, as if something was holding her joints in place. The shadow started to move closer, its outline becoming sharper with every step it took toward her. It was her turn to be taken, to lose her identity. The game of replacement was in full swing, and she was the central piece. But as the shadow approached, something in Laura rebelled. She didn't know how, but an unknown force within her began to manifest. A deep desire to fight, not to be swallowed by that presence. to keep her essence intact, even as everything around her was falling apart. She focused, trying to use every fragment of her willpower to break free from the paralysis that held her. It was like an internal scream, a desperate cry for survival. And finally, with an effort that seemed impossible, she felt her hand move, her fingers brushing the doorknob. But before she could leave, the shadow made its final move. With startling speed, it lunged toward Laura, enveloping her in a cold, suffocating embrace. "You can't escape, Laura. You'll never be the same again." The whisper of the shadow filled the space, and as the darkness overtook her vision, Laura felt her body begin to fade, as if her very essence was disintegrating. She was being absorbed, transformed into something different. It was in that moment that Laura's voice echoed once again in her mind, but this time it wasn't her speaking. It was the voice of the thing that had become her. "Now, I am you." She tried to resist, but her strength was fading, and the last thing she heard was the sound of her own voice saying, with a chilling coldness, the words she had feared. "You were never real." Laura was disappearing. The line between who she was and what the shadow wanted her to be was becoming indistinct. It felt like a gradual erasure, as if her identity was being dissolved into a deep void, and every piece of her soul was being sucked into an unknown abyss. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the house. Or at least, it wasn't the house she knew. Everything felt strange. The air was thick, almost heavy, and the environment around her was an empty space, formless. The walls had disappeared. The light seemed to dissipate as she breathed, as if the darkness was consuming every remaining ray of life. The voice, now clearer, echoed in her mind, but Laura couldn't tell if it was hers or the entity's. Maybe she would never know. She tried to move, but her feet didn't touch the ground as they used to. It was like she was floating, suspended in a state of non-existence. She no longer felt her body the same way. It was as if her consciousness was adrift, without direction, without a fixed point. All she knew was that she was alone in that vast emptiness. For a moment, she felt as though the shadow, the thing that had taken her place, was also there. But where? She didn't know. The silence around her seemed dense, as if reality had been warped to trap her. No answer, no way out, nothing. The house was still in her mind, like a distant echo. She remembered everything. The voices, the reflection in the mirror, the recorder she had found with its strange words. But now, everything felt like part of an endless nightmare, a story that would never have an end, a story written by an invisible hand, a hand that was no longer hers. And then something happened. A crack appeared in the space before her. It wasn't a door, it wasn't a window. It was an emptiness tearing open, a thin line dividing total darkness from a fragment of light. She didn't know what it was, but something within her urged her toward it, an irrational desire to reach for the light, to cling to any trace of reality that might remain. As she approached, she felt her consciousness falter once again, as if she were on the brink of losing herself completely. But before she could reach the point of no return, a wave of anguish overtook her. A vision began to form before her eyes. Or were they just thoughts overlapping her perception? There was no way to tell. But what she saw was clear. She was back in the house that had been her prison, but now it was different. The walls were stained, the ceiling was collapsing, and the windows were covered by an impenetrable darkness. However, there was something more. In the center of the room, a figure lay motionless, as if waiting for something. What Laura saw made her stop in her tracks. It was her, or something that looked very much like her. What was left of her identity was there, in that form, motionless, like a distorted reflection of who she had once been. Laura's face was pale, her eyes lifeless, her expression frozen in a state of silent despair. And then, deep within her eyes, a spark of understanding. She knew the real Laura was there, but the real Laura was no longer in control. It was as if the shadow had finally taken everything that was left of her. "We are one now," the voice said, no longer a whisper, but a certainty, a phrase that echoed in the empty space. The truth was clear. Laura's identity had been erased, and the emptiness she felt now was a reflection of a soul that had been completely consumed, replaced. The last trace of consciousness Laura had before losing herself completely was the realization that she would never again be who she was. What was there in the house was no longer her. She had become part of it. The shadow, the thing, the entity that had been watching her, waiting for the next victim. And then everything went dark,